So this says weighty, the first two characters, and the last two characters say steep. Wait, if you look carefully, you can see two of the characters are the same. And the first two means crisis, and the last two means opportunity. And you heard from Mike and you heard from Phil, we have an incredible crisis on our hands. At the same time, with war danger, with the destruction of what used to be the leading nation in the world, namely the United States, and the complete collapse of the transatlantic system. And then we have what Mike and Phil went through. We have the BRICS nations joined by a lot of other nations. Over half the world's population are now going with the ideas, moving the ideas which was made in the United States, or let's say furthest developed in the United States, namely the American system. And nobody in America knows about it except through what we are doing and our literature. So I will definitely recommend to people, if you did not already get it out at the book table, and if you haven't read about the BRICS summit that took place 6 weeks ago, read it, because there's a complete Goebbels propaganda. It is not reported in the United States media at all. That is, we have a total revolution taking place 6 weeks ago, and nobody talks about it. So therefore, if it's not on television, it's not real. I want to try, as quick as I can, to give people an idea that what we had happened 6 weeks ago and then escalating until today, with what Mike went through, building of now building of 3 major canals, collaborations. I will not go through all the things that are happening now. You have to go in on the LaRouche PAC website. It is super exciting. It is like with accelerating speed. I want to prove to you in a personal manner today that it was LaRouche who did it, who did this. It was through the ideas as being spearheaded by Lyndon LaRouche in the last several decades that has created a situation where now over half the world's population are creating a new paradigm, are creating the basis for a future for mankind. I would ask people to kind of follow with the arc of history how this has functioned, because Phil made fun of Americans talking about being practical and we can't do anything. The only tool in history, which Schiller, when you work on it like that, Schiller describes history as a sublime object. When you think about history as how the ideas which man is innate, I mean it's in man when he's born, the capability for creating ideas, when that is being used, we can, that's what we have happening over the last 4 decades, taking shape, that ideas really was put into a seed in the ground and now are coming out in full bloom. But it goes further back than just in the last 4 decades. It's ideas, if you think about history, how Phil went through the Bushman, how man has, we were running around hunting animals and living in caves, and what advances and leaps mankind has taken for the last several thousand years. Next. So here we have what you can call then a Promethean image of the world language. If you think about the globe of ours, and think about how huge areas of it is not developed, and now that over half the world population, leaders representing over half the world's population, is now embarking on developing the globe at large. collaborating around a common principle for mutual development and creating the means for doing so. I want to put out and remember the year 1975 for the older members of the LaRouche organization. That was a very important year. That was the year where Lyndon LaRouche put out the idea of an international development bank. And I think in almost all the nations, it was a green pamphlet. It was green in Denmark and it was green in the United States. I used to go out and sell it at the unemployment centers in Denmark in Danish. We had it in Danish, German, French, Swedish, Italian, Spanish, and so forth. The idea was to create a new bank that would provide long-term cheap credit for in-depth infrastructure developments. That was the idea. Now, jump forward to 6 weeks ago, where the foundation of a new development bank was made by the summit in Brazil with the BRICS meeting, namely an alternative to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the corrupt and bankrupt transatlantic system, which is controlled by the financial oligarchy. To put an end to that, countries representing half the world's population decided to form a new development bank. Also, China, at the same time, simultaneously have taken initiative to an Asian development bank, very much based on the same ideas which LaRouche put out in the International Development Bank in 1975. In 1976, a good friend of LaRouche, Indira Gandhi, gave a speech at Colombo, Sri Lanka, where she called for a new just world economic order and new financial structures to support such a new just world economic order, very much based upon LaRouche's ideas put forward a year earlier. Indeed, I was so excited being a young woman at the time that I was leading the Danish organization. So I called a big party in our office because we have won. LaRouche goes out calling for an international development bank, for great infrastructure programs, and then countries, the non-allied countries, a year later, led by Indira Gandhi, goes out and declare that is the policy. But we were not, the forces were not strong enough at that time, and I'm going to try to give an idea now how this has been building through the decades. Can you go forward, please? Yeah. A lot of you know this. This is what LaRouche has called a development corridor. And the reason I think it's important is because when you saw these lines across the globe on the previous slide, it is very important that we think about it how is the most efficiently regarding physical economy. So if you look at the big round things, in the center you have industrial cities surrounded by intense agriculture. The small white circles you see are smaller cities. You have the blue thing going across, it could be a river or a canal. You have another stretch just underneath the blue, which could be gas pipelines, oil pipelines. You have roads connecting maglev, the whole big trunk of the maglev connecting the city centers. So the idea is to have cities that are 750 to 1 million people each, designed from scratch to be very beautiful and be very efficient for people to function in and to live in, with science centers in the middle, cultural houses, what have you, parks, everything that we can put underground, we put underground. But economically, to think about these development corridors, which is like 150, like 100 miles broad, as a gigantic assembly line. Can you go back to the world language, where you literally have like a power line of activity, of new cities, of power generation, of mining, of processing of the product, and then you can research centers and so forth connecting the entire globe. And that is a Promethean map. This is a map which is anti-oligarchical. This is a future which is anti-oligarchical. Man, we have in history for the last several thousand years, there has been an ongoing fight of what is man, what is the nature of man. Is man just a slave? Is man a subject? Cheap labor and so forth? Or is there something very special and unique about man? And we have had empires. Most of the man's existence have been controlled by one empire after the other, with the Hobbesian view that if you conquer somebody else, you control them and you can take them as your slaves and so forth, so Phil went through a little bit. So this is, when we talk about having a new era of mankind, when LaRouche talks about a new era of mankind, we are talking about an oligarchical, imperial, free planet. Or let's put it, an oligarchical, imperial, free universe. That this is where the optimal development possibilities for each human being is being sought. So let's continue two down. This is a young picture. So now I'm taking a jump. This is a young picture of Leibniz. And Leibniz was very, so now I'm going to give you two arcs. And a lot of stuff I'm going to skip, but I'm going to give you two arcs regarding how the ideas of what we now have as the world language and what is coming together around the BRICS nations and their allies represent. So here we have Leibniz, a very close friend of Lyndon LaRouche and this organization. He was very, we got in the Declaration of Independence the notion of Geneva rights of man, with the section in the end, right to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when Leibniz talks about happiness, not property, but happiness, he talks about the innate capability of each human being for creativity, for wisdom. So it's pursuit of happiness that we, it's part of the inalienable rights of man, that we create the conditions that each human being can do so. And so Leibniz was very excited about China. The last 30 years of his life, he had a lot of correspondence back and forth with missionaries in China. And he wrote about it. And he, to my knowledge, is the first man who had the idea of developing all of Eurasia from China to Europe, where he says, let's take the two cultured places in the east and in the west and let them stretch out their arms and cultivate the land in between. He also, he's in the end of his life, Leibniz is in a big debate with Newton, a representative of Newton, Clark. And in that debate, he writes a treatise or discourse called On the Natural Theology of the Chinese. Because like today, when people attack the Chinese, they attacked Newton and others attacked Chinese at that time for all kinds of things. So they say they're not Christian, they have all these rights, they are just barbarians and so on. So Leibniz goes through key ideas in this on the natural theology of the Chinese, which I recommend people to read. Where he goes through what the key ideas of Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, how he thinks, and then Leibniz says, here's what I think. So things, I'm a Christian, and I think like Confucius. It's okay that they're not Christians. Their national theology is fine for us to collaborate with. Next. So here we have a one of the greatest Americans ever born and lived, John Quincy Adams, he was not practical at all. He made this nation a continental nation, and he fought for ideas. He thought that he knew that we were going to have a civil war 20 years before it happened, because, and he calls it a sublime war because of slavery. I could talk about this gentleman for hours, so I'll be careful not to get off that. But he was one of the things I am very inspired of with John Quincy Adams is that the last 18 years of his life, after having been ambassador to 5 nations, Secretary of State, President, he was the last 18 years of his life, he was in the American Congress, where he on a daily basis would go up and make a fool out of the Confederacy and the slave owners in the Confederacy. And he tricked them and whatever. And this was all recorded in the newspapers. There were the people sitting taking notes, and in that way the North was organized so that indeed Lincoln would have sufficient strength later on to defeat the Confederacy. But what inspires me is that he was old, he had all kinds of aches and pains, and the slave power took, got more and more influence, and everything seemed lost, and you had a horrible destruction of his economic policy and so forth. But he said, this is the best years of my life was when I was in the American Congress. And he had this total trust in ideas and fighting for the right ideas, no matter whether you can see the result of them or not. Because if it's right, you fight for it. And lo and behold, it does create results later on. So what he did in 1812, Phil mentioned that when we were in war with Britain again, trying to destroy this republic, he, together with other key Americans like John Jay, one of the guys writing in the Confederate paper, Boudinot IV and others, they formed something called the ABCFM, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. And so 1812, the idea was to go over to Asia with the best ideas of the United States, the founding ideas of the United States, to do good. And you have to think about it. In 1812, here the British are attacking. It's a new nation that is just beginning to figure out how to function. And you have these founding fathers having the idea of sending missionaries across the United States, where we didn't have a railroad, but not only across the United States. If you could imagine what it took to travel across the United States at that point, and then cross the Pacific. Can you imagine what it was to cross the Pacific at that time? So they had the idea to send people to Asia to spread the ideas of the United States. Because as you have in the back of your program, John Quincy Adams was convinced that the ideas upon which the United States is founded, the principles upon which the United States is founded, should spread around the globe. If you think about the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution, if you think about the idea of inalienable rights, well, they go for every single person in the world, whether you are from Uganda or Denmark or Germany, and that was the idea. That's also why the Schiller Institute, that our founding document is the Declaration of Independence, just slightly changed a few places. So this was very impractical, to go across the United States to spread some ideas and then cross the Pacific. So next, just a case example, which is Hawaii, because in 1820 you had 15 people going to Hawaii. You had a printer, you had teachers, you had a farmer, and the idea was to teach well, if they didn't have a written language, to create a written language. Hawaii didn't have a written language at that time, so they created a written language. And then, of course, they had a printer, very important, so they could print books and pamphlets. They taught people at the news, agricultural, they stressed teaching Greek to teaching Latin, teaching science, and in particular agriculture and medicine. In a matter of 6 years, you could see you had 400 assistant teachers teaching thousands and thousands of students. And then you take just 11 years after the first 15 people had arrived in Hawaii, you had 40% of the population getting educated in 1,100 schools. It's very unlikely that Hawaii would have been part of the United States if it wasn't for those missionaries in 1820. Actually, Britain did try to take over the Hawaiians. The Royal Navy came in 1843, right after the British had defeated China and burned their flags, took them over, put up high taxes and so forth. But they were defeated again. But so that's the case example, Hawaii. And Hawaii functioned as the hub, was its position to then go further over to Asia. Next. This is a guy called David Abil. He came to southern part of China in 1829, that is 9 years after the first people had come to Hawaii. And he had, one thing with these missionaries, the first thing was not to convert people to Christianity. The key thing was to teach the key ideas about the United States. So here you have David Abil, he comes to China, he learns Chinese, and he then teaches. The key thing was to teach. So he describes himself that the best student he had was a guy called Xu Diyu. And Xu Diyu is a very famous and very powerful man in China. In the southern part of China, you have a big province called the Fujian province, and he was the governor of Fujian province. He was also steeped in classical Chinese culture. He studied Confucius and Mencius and so forth. And you have to think about when Abil met Xu, this was after the Opium War had ended in a complete defeat of China in 1942, where Britain took 5 harbors, other colonial powers took over chunks of China, the French took countries like Cambodia and Laos and so forth. So it's totally taken over by colonialists. So here you have, think about ideas and how ideas function. So here you have these American missionaries. And so Xu meets David Abil, and Abil begins to teach him. And Abil said, I never met a student who was so excited. He asked me tons of questions, but he also says, I don't think he's ever going to convert to Christianity. And he doesn't really care. The key thing is to teach. So he spreads out all the maps that David Abil does, all the maps of the whole world. He describes the cultures in the different parts of the world, and so on. And Xu then in 1850 writes a book called A Brief Analysis of the World, which is a history book about the whole world, which had incredible import for further developments in China that I cannot go into, because this was studied by leading scholars in China at the time. This was a book that for the first time the Chinese could look upon their countries from outside, seeing all kinds of other countries. And specifically important was that the country that Xu in his book described as the best of all countries was that of the United States of America. And the greatest hero of all heroes was that of George Washington. He even described how he takes Chinese heroes and say, okay, there's this Chinese hero, there's this Chinese hero, but none of them are as great as George Washington. So you have actually later on, after we had won the Civil War in 1867, a guy who was an American guy, Burlingame, who was called the ambassador for China. He traveled around in Europe with a group of high official Chinese to teach about China and get connections with China. There was efforts right after the Civil War was won to recognize the sovereignty of China from the side of the United States. So Burlingame makes sure that Xu, this student of Abil, this governor, that he gets a big portrait of George Washington. In the Washington monument to this day, you will see an inscription on stone that was sent over from China in 1853 in Chinese, where Xu praises George Washington and the system that we have here with no kings, no dukes, and so on. So this is an earlier arc of history leading directly into this gentleman. Oh, we never saw Xu, I'm sorry, this is Xu Jiyu, sorry. Next. And here we have Sun Yat-sen. Very brief. Sun Yat-sen single-handedly organized the overthrow of the Emperor of China. He raised the funds. He created the support groups all over the world, the biggest of which was in Japan. And why do you think that? That was because during the Civil War, exactly like forward thinking, like we built the Transcontinental Railroad, America between 1860 and 1870 sent 200 missionaries of different kinds, printers, agricultural people, and so forth, to Japan as a flank to counter the imperial forces in Asia. So remember that, and now I go back to Sun Yat-sen. In 1879, Sun Yat-sen arrives in Hawaii. And he's only 13 years old. So if you think about it, if you remember what I said before regarding all the stuff that had been going on in Hawaii with the schooling and so forth, his brother is really upset because very soon Sun Yat-sen is really excited about the missionary work, America, and so on. So his brother sends him back to China, but it's too late. Sun Yat-sen studies medicine in a hospital that was built by the American missionaries, and he gets baptized there by an American missionary. And he has learned through the United States and through all the work by the missionaries indispensable things for him to lead the Chinese Revolution and win it. Indeed, 2,100 officers are being trained in 3 different Chinatowns in the United States, secretly set up by Sun Yat-sen, and then these officers are smuggled over to China to participate in the overthrow of the emperor. And it's very unlikely that if that had not happened, that Sun Yat-sen would have succeeded. What he does also, he writes in 1917, I really recommend people to read it, a book called The Vital Problem of China. I have it here in Chinese. We published that because it is so powerful that it was not in Chinese. The last print in Chinese was 1947. If you ask older Chinese that have very good knowledge, Chinese scholars and so forth, about this writing of Sun Yat-sen, they will not have it in their collected works of Sun Yat-sen. So when we figured that out, we published it. And the reason it's so powerful is that he goes through the way the British Empire functions with manipulating nations against each other to control everything from outside. As he says, never be a friend with Britain. If you are a friend with Britain, she's going to treat you like a silkworm farmer treats his silkworms really well. Oh, you get all the food you need and all the temperatures you need and so forth. And then when all the silk has gotten out of the silkworms, you're either going to be burned or drowned. That's what he, but it's much more than that. So he wrote that in, so he did everything. He raised the money for the revolution. He also knew his enemies, the British Empire. And then after the end of the First World War, and this leads directly up to our world language today, Sun Yat-sen knows with the Versailles Treaty after the First World War that this is really bad. So he writes a program called, and you can get that on the internet, it's called On the International Development of China. He writes that in 1919, shortly after the Versailles Treaty. And in the first issue of this program, he says in the preface, with the Versailles Treaty, the bases have been laid for a Second World War. Therefore, I now make this program for an international development of China as a basis for peace and development. If my program is not being adopted, then we are going to have a Second World War. He writes that in the preface. This is a detailed description of building of 100,000 miles of railroad, 5 new ports, the 3 gorges dam that was built and completed a few years ago. He not only describes it for China because he calls it the international development of China. No, he has ideas about transport corridors going to Europe, going to Baghdad, crisscrossing Africa. And this is important because we took Sun Yat-sen's program and we updated it, and this is what became our Eurasian language. So the basis for this, which many of you might have seen, was Sun Yat-sen's program from 1919. So just to see how the ideas are developing. Next. Yeah, this is just one more thing about ideas. That's the only reason I took that this time. This stand where you can see Lincoln on one side and Sun Yat-sen on the other side. And you can see under Lincoln where it says of the people, by the people, and for the people. Sun Yat-sen modeled himself upon the United States and very much upon Lincoln. And he developed something he called Sanmin-Ju-Yi, the 3 principles of the people. And you have them underneath Sun Yat-sen's picture. You see you have the map of China in the background. And he said again and again, I got those principles from Abraham Lincoln. And he would quote Abraham Lincoln again and again. And when he made the whole Constitution, how China should be governed and so forth, he did it the American way, but with Chinese characteristics, as he said, modeled upon the different, the different branches of government. He added 2 more branches than we have in the United States. What we had, now I go back to, or forward to Lyndon LaRouche, again in the 1970s and 1980s. I said in the very beginning, the International Development Bank, LaRouche's proposal for that in 1975. He had all kinds of other proposals. There will be too much to go into, but I will just mention a few, like Operation Juarez in '83, I believe. This was based on a request from Mexico's President Portillo, and LaRouche proposes that the nations go together and use their debt as a weapon, the so-called debt bomb, and say we are not going to pay it on the debt, from the demands of what the IMF and so forth say. We are going to use the debt as a power. So And it's I would recommend people to get it and read it. You can see what is shaping up in Latin America today, and with the BRICS. See, I'm going now to hone in very much on China, but the work that we did in Latin America, spreading the ideas of LaRouche, is now what is making it feasible today to come together with the forces that are now coming together around the BRICS. Also, in that period, you had the Strategic Defense Initiative. You had the Pacific Basin development, a 50-year development policy for the Indo-Pacific Basin, very, very detailed development program, all in the 80s. So then, also in the 80s, as just a fun little story, because No Limits to Growth was sold at a book table in New York to a Chinese. The Chinese gentleman, I think it could be a woman, but I think it's a gentleman, took it back to China and gave it to a higher official who read it and gave it back to the first person, and with all kind of notation in the margin, and said, this book should be translated. So LaRouche's book, we had no idea about it before years later. LaRouche's book, No Limits to Growth, was translated and printed in millions of copies in China in the 80s. That's where they had this whole push, when you had the opening up of China, that they translated all kinds of books from the West. And then the scholars would meet and discuss the content to figure out what they could use and what they could not use. That's how they did it. Next. Oh no. And then, yeah, we can, that's okay. Now we have seating, now let me just, let's just do this. So here we have LaRouches in Taiwan in 1988. Also in 1988, the same year, LaRouche gives a historic address at a Hotel Kempinski in Berlin, West Berlin, because we had the wall at that time. I would recommend anybody who has not seen that speech to go in and search it, and it was prophetic. LaRouche calls in 1988, he calls for the reunification of Germany, and he says in the broadcast, he says in the press conference, he says, what I'm saying here is going to be studied very carefully in Moscow in a matter of a couple of hours. LaRouche also warns that when we have a process of reunification of Germany, then the British Empire is going to try to create a war using Yugoslavia to create a war in the Baltics. Everything that LaRouche said came through. Next. Now you have up in the corner, you have the fall of the wall in 1989 in Berlin. And then the big picture, you have the Tiananmen Square in May of 1989. At that time, LaRouche was in jail. And Helga, so the wall was down, there was opening up to the east, and Helga led an effort in collaboration with LaRouche in jail, where Helga, his wife, now started a organizing drive into the east, into Hungary, Poland, Russia, Czechoslovakia, with the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. And we got many, many friends. Actually, some of the Russians thought that the ideas of LaRouche, of which some of them they had worked on, could not possibly have been figured out by one guy, that he must have sent agents into Soviet Union and stolen their ideas. So after LaRouche got out of jail, they invited him to Russia, and these top scientists, and they peppered him with questions, and they realized, wow, it was coming from this one man, and he had not stolen the ideas, and he had developed them independently on his own. So I'm saying this because that LaRouche was in jail for many of the older collaborators and associates of LaRouche was a real danger. The idea was that LaRouche, and horrible, the idea was that LaRouche was going to stay in jail and die in jail. And so we mobilized more than we ever would have done before. At least I know that I did, and I know a number of colleagues that worked, not that we worked harder, we were just, our intention meant that there was nothing you could not do. So we embarked on a big push to get supporters all over the world, in particular people with names, people that were parliamentarians, deans of law schools, law professors, and so forth from the entire world to sign petitions that would go in that LaRouche was a political prisoner and how this had happened, and put these names into international newspapers as advertisements to publicize that for the whole world. So in order for people to put a name on a petition, and that their name and their position was going to be put in international newspapers, that LaRouche was a political prisoner, you really had to organize people in depth in order for them to do so. And we ended up having 400 parliamentarians from all over the world sign this exoneration petition for Lyndon LaRouche. Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General, said this is the most political case since 1876. This push to get LaRouche exonerated meant also that the push to get his ideas out, what this man represented, was much more intense in many more nations than we would otherwise have done, which is ironic because it was really awful and bad that LaRouche was in jail. But it was also used to push for the knowledge and recognition of Lyndon LaRouche. So now I'll go very quick a whole bunch of pictures from a one slice. I'm not going to have anything of Latin America. I'm not going to have anything from Russia. I'm just going to have a slice of what I personally have been involved with regarding creating the basis for what we now have with the BRICS nations and China as a leading force in creating this. Next. This is a conference in Hong Kong in 1991. And that was on Sun Yat-sen in the 21st century. And you can imagine what we presented there regarding the importance of Sun Yat-sen, in particular around his international development of China, that is collaboration among nations for in-depth infrastructure development. This is also when our Chinese newsletter, that is a little brother to our executive intelligence review, that's when that begins. Next. So here you can see the beginning of, this is the first time that we have the Eurasian land bridge on the cover of the EIR. This is in 1992. This is also the year where we have a week-long, we've organized a group of Chinese from mainland China, we organized them to come to Germany for week-long classes and presentations on the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. I go to Taiwan a lot, and next. One of the crucial things about Chinese too, which is also to bear in mind today, is that they read and they write poetry. But very important, they read. So here you have a gentleman who used to be a minister. He's passed away. All the pictures I'm showing on the next pictures too, they're all passed away. He used to be a minister. He signed for LaRouche's exoneration because if you get old guys, the way the Chinese are functioning, if you get old guys moving, they will tell the younger ones what to do, and the younger ones will follow orders. So this guy built the biggest steel plant in Asia at the time in Taiwan. And first time I met him, he said, "Wow, that LaRouche, he's quite a guy." And then the next time he said, "What do you think? What do you think I think about LaRouche?" I said, "No, what do you think?" "I think he's a genius." That's after he had read some stuff. And then the third time I met him, he said, you know what I think about LaRouche? No, what do you think? I think he's a gift from God. So, next. This is Chiang Kai-shek's son, Jiang Weiguo, who also did a lot of work to get exonerations for Lyndon LaRouche. Next. And this is Li Guoding, a former economy minister in Taiwan, same thing. Next. This is a gentleman called Liang Shurong, who was very upset because he thought he was going to die without ever getting back to mainland China. He came from mainland China. And, but since also these characters and many others, but they have all passed, so that's also part of why I'm showing them. They were all crucial too in the push for peaceful reunification between Taiwan and mainland China, so that Taiwan could not anymore be used as a player in creating tensions across the strait. And all this again is taking place in Hungary, Poland, Russia, very particularly. Intense education and meeting with people around LaRouche. So this is, I'm only showing it from one side. We ended up having 30 parliamentarians in Taiwan and 3 former ministers signing for LaRouche's exoneration. Next. Yeah, this is in the parliament in Taiwan, where if you all the way over to the right over there, this is LaRouche's name in Chinese. And it was kind of funny because I was doing organizing in the parliament to get these people to sign for LaRouche's exoneration. So one of them, the one to the left with the round face, he says, let's have a press conference. He was a little bit radical in the parliament. And I said, well, great. So he called a press conference, and I didn't know what they were going to do. So I was standing at 7-Eleven making copies of all kinds of literature and so forth, so where you have to put coins in for every single copy and this kind of stuff, and come with my bags. When I came to the parliament the next day, they had made this nice sign, and they had made copies of the literature I'd given to them, so it was all professional, done, and stable, and the whole thing. So, but also, of course, for them to do that, they had to know in depth LaRouche's ideas, otherwise they were not going to sign. So in that way, we got inroad. Next. This is our little brother, the Chinese EIR. There you can see the racial language. Next. This is 95. This is Helga LaRouche in China in 1996. She gave a speech on the Eurasian language. It was a big fight because the British, there was one keynote speaker was British, and the British did not want Helga to speak at the conference. But then a couple of Chinese gentlemen waged a fight to get her to speak. As they say, she's the only one, the organization that she represents is the only one in the rest of the world who have these ideas. So of course she should speak, and she ended up speaking and doing many other things. Next. And here we have it, the Eurasian language report, where many people we meet now, when they look at the maps and so forth, they say, look, we already built that, and we built this and that, we have to make a new one. Well, guess what? We need the funds to get it printed. So it's almost done, with a preface by Helga LaRouche to get a new edition of the world language to come out. And see what it says, the new Silk Road. So you know that Xi Jinping last autumn declared in Kazakhstan a policy for China of building a new Silk Road, an economic belt. Well, I met with a guy in Washington 3 or 4 months ago. He had been in Washington 2 years ago, and then he was on visit from China, and then he was on visit, and I saw him. And we talked, and after about an hour or so, I pulled out our Eurasian language report. And he looks at it, and he looks at the date, and he says, oh my God, you did it. You did it. I thought it was Xi Jinping who did it, but you did it. And he was sitting, going through all the maps and so forth. You should know also that there was also just a few months ago, one of our people in Washington had met a Chinese gentleman who knew everything about LaRouche, or had a lot of knowledge about LaRouche. So he asked him, how can you know? You never met us, how come you know all this? And he said, oh, I've studied it at the National Library in Beijing, because there we have all these Chinese EIR, and they have been preserved and been made available for the Chinese scholars. Because we used to send the Chinese EIR to all the key libraries in China. And I would get cards every year thanking for the newsletters, but I had no idea that they preserved them and made them available, and now people come from China here, and they have studied LaRouche before they even meet us. Next. This is also 1997. This is Helga at Lianyungang, which is the out at the coast where the Silk Road starts. This is a very important year, 1997. I have to go a little fast because of the time, but 1997, LaRouche warns, in the beginning of 1997, he warns that Asia is going to be attacked financially before the end of that year. So Helga warns people in mainland China about that. I want people in Taiwan, and nobody believed LaRouche. So when indeed it did happen, LaRouche's influence just skyrocketed. And that also meant that LaRouche's warnings regarding a wrong economic policy, because remember there was a time where the Chinese made a lot of emphasis on the development of the coastal areas and not in the interior areas. But more and more, because there's been big fights inside China in the leadership, more and more LaRouche's ideas was adhered to because he turned out to be right. Actually 10 years later, in 2007, when LaRouche came out with a new warning, I got a call in New York from one of the missions there, UN missions, of a woman who was the first secretary who wanted to meet. And I went to meet her, and I said, so what's up? She said, well, I heard Helga Zepp-LaRouche come out with LaRouche's warning in 1997 about Asia going to be attacked. So after that, when I hear LaRouche come with a warning, I listen. Because she had not believed it in 1997, so now she was listening up. This is just a few tidbits of examples. Next. This is in 1997, Helga LaRouche in New York. She becomes the Silk Road lady. Next. There she is at a press conference in New York in 1997, and we have the land bridge. Next. This is a so-called secret week-long meetings with a group of Chinese coming in. Nobody knew it except very few that were involved. Nobody in our New Jersey office had any idea that what Phil and I was doing going into New York every day. Lyndon and Helga LaRouche came to New York for 1 week of classes and presentations and discussions with this group of people from China. And you can see what Helga has there. The development corridor. What were we discussing? The Eurasian land bridge. Next. And that's one of the, we had every day to have lunch and dinner and so forth, of course, and discuss. Next. Yeah, this lady there is just a fun story, because after that 1 week, we went upstate New York where we wanted to show the Chinese American farms and American factories, like automobile factories and so forth. And the very first stop, we made a rest stop. This lady says, you could go up to the lady at the counter in the rest stop, we bought some burgers or whatever it was. I have been together with Lyndon LaRouche for a whole week. She was really excited, and the lady behind the counter, really, he is such a great man. So that was like a double effect there. Next. Yeah, this is from a conference where I participated in, again, giving presentations on the Eurasian land bridge. And just to see how it functions with people, you see the picture of the guy at the front, at the top of the ladder. Just keep his face in mind. Next. This is Lyndon LaRouche. He was invited as a featured speaker in 2002 and 2007 in Los Angeles. Next. And he was hosted by the Consul General of Los Angeles, who's sitting in the middle. And the guy to the right is the guy you saw in Dubai at the conference there. He came to Los Angeles to this conference. He was also the gentleman who Hu Jintao, the former president, when Hu Jintao wanted to honor Sun Yat-sen in Beijing, he asked this gentleman to come with a delegation of 30 people from Taiwan to come to Beijing. And there Hu Jintao, in front of a huge picture of Sun Yat-sen, gave a big speech of Sun Yat-sen with this gentleman and his 30 delegations sitting on the front row. So the world is kind of, with ideas, is functioning like that. Next. And then some people know, some people don't. We had in New York, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, at least 4-6 times a year, press conferences for Chinese press only, where there would be translation. One thing with the Chinese press, it's the only press I know of in US. If you invite to a press conference, there will always be reporters there. I have never organized a Chinese press conference and there was not reporters. And they will always cover it in articles, and the articles will be straight articles. That doesn't, in any other group that I know, that I have tried to do at least in the United States, function like that. So we did a lot of those. Next. This is San Francisco. Next. This is New York. Next. This is a presentation with one of the contacts from Los Angeles. This is in mainland China, in a major university, where I give a presentation at the historical faculty about the Eurasian language. Next. This is Taipei, where I gave a presentation on Eurasian language. Next. This is in Chufu. You can see the map up there. Chufu is where Confucius was born and where he's buried. It was a wonderful place. And you can see again the map, the world language, to a bunch of students. Next. There was a lot of students, and you can see their faces. They were very serious, right? See their faces? And there was a lot of questions. I gave the presentation from 7 to 9, and I first left at 11 because they were pampering me afterwards and wouldn't let me go. All on the Eurasian language, and what connection that has to Confucius and whatever. Next. Yeah. This is, if you go in on the Chinese search machine, Baidu, and you put in LaRouche's Chinese name, you have 109,000 results popping up. At least a little while ago, it's probably more now. Next. This is LaRouche and Xinhua. They have written him several times. Next. This is very significant. Helga LaRouche was back in China in February, and she was interviewed by the CCTV, and I would suggest people look it up, because it was it was not just a nice interview. He was really tough, the interviewer, and it was very educational. And there you see the new Silk Road lady. Well, she was a Silk Road lady since 1997, but now it has been admitted by the CCTV. This is government stuff. LaRouche was interviewed earlier by CCTV. They flew in from Los Angeles actually to interview him, and it was never broadcast. It has to be okayed. Helga being on there is a very big signal. And then you know, of course, LaRouche in the Russian press, Helga in the Chinese press. She was just in China daily. The dam has broken, so to speak, because we are the only ones in the United States as an organization representing the American system, which is now what China is moving on. China is moving on the ideas of the American system. With all the problems and so forth, that's what they're moving on. The space colonization, research in agriculture, research in health. You should see what they're doing. It's just they're going for the frontier of all branches of knowledge. Next. Okay, and now Helga was just in Russia. She was traveling on the Silk Road, and then she was at a conference in Lanzhou, which is like the smack middle. In the smack middle, I cannot get up. There is it.
Yep.
Right there. Yeah. At a conference on the Eurasian, on the New Silk Road, and Helga being Helga, she has done all kinds of other things too. There was 100 experts there from 21 different nations at that conference, where Helga was. Next, I will end with this. This is a very famous quote from a longer statement from Confucius, which is a very famous statement. So it reads in Chinese, "Tian Sha Wei Gong," and it's literally it's an idea of the general welfare, that the planet is here and the universe for everyone. It's public property, so to speak. But it's more than that. It comes from a saying by Confucius where he talks about the general welfare, where he talks about a future age of a great commonwealth of peace and prosperity. A new era, this is what we are facing today, a new era where nobody are hungry, old people are being taken care of, kids are being taken care of, you don't have to lock your door. People, when they are using the resources, they are doing it for public gain, never just for private gain. That everything you do is for humanity and your fellow human being as such. So this is taken from there, and I want to end it here. I have more, but I want to end it here for time reasons.
Okay, so if you're still here, you made it through the introduction. If you're not angry about what's happened to your country, if you're not upset by the compromises you and your fellow Americans have made to let this happen, and you're ready to redeem yourself and your fellow Americans, if you're not excited about what the rest of the world is doing and what we can participate in and what we can help lead, then you don't got a clue. So, at this point, we're going to reserve the discussions and question sections because we have gone a little bit over schedule. So we'll provide lunch. Sarah Stewart and Alexandria will be in the back. They have baskets. If you can, we ask people to contribute $10 for the lunch. It's all you can eat, sandwiches, vegetables, salad. It's much appreciated. We're going to restart the process so people can sit outside. There are a few benches and chairs outside in the shade, or you can just eat here. We're going to restart at 2:30 to regain a little bit of time. So it's a quick lunch, but people didn't come here just for the food. So we're going to nourish your mind. The second panel will involve an advanced scientific discussion with members of the LaRouche Policy Committee, the Basic Scientific Research Team, as well as some of our most advanced historical research on California, the drought, and the potential in the western states. So thanks for participating this afternoon. So far, there's a lot more to come, so get some food, have some discussion. We'll start back up at 2:30.
It's not real. I want to try as quick as I can to give people an idea that what we had happened 6 weeks ago and then escalating until today, with what Mike went through, the building of now building of 3 major canals, collaborations. I will not go through all the things that are happening now. You have to go in on the LaRouche PAC website. It is super exciting. It is like with accelerating speed. I want to prove to you in a personal manner today that it was LaRouche who did this. it was through the ideas as being spearheaded by Lyndon LaRouche in the last several decades that has created a situation where now over half the world's population are creating a new paradigm, are creating the basis for a future for mankind. I would ask people to kind of follow with the arc of history how this has functioned, because Phil made fun of Americans talking about being practical and we can't do anything. The only tool in history, which Schiller, when you work on it like that, Schiller describes history as a sublime object. When you think about history as how the ideas which man is innate, I mean it's in man when he's born, the capability for creating ideas, when that is being used, we can, that's what we have happening over the last 4 decades, taking shape, that ideas really was put into a seed in the ground and now are coming out in full bloom. But it goes further back than just in the last 4 decades. It's ideas, if you think about history, how Phil went through the Bush. Okay, first. No, that's not the whole thing. You want the first one? Yeah, but that's not the whole time. How about that? Yes. So this says Wady, the first 2 characters, and the last 2 characters say Steve. Wait, if you look carefully, you can see that 2 of the characters are the same. And the first 2 means crisis, and the last 2 means opportunity. And you heard from Mike and you heard from Phil, we have an incredible crisis on our hands. At the same time, with war danger, with the destruction of what used to be the leading nation in the world, namely the United States, and a complete collapse of the transatlantic system. And then we have what Mike and Phil went through. We have the BRICS nations joined by a lot of other nations. Over half the world's population are now going with the ideas, moving the ideas which was made in the United States, or let's say furthest developed in the United States, namely the American system. And nobody in America knows about it except through what we are doing and our literature. So I will definitely recommend to people, if you did not already get it out at the book table, and if you haven't read about the BRICS summit that took place 6 weeks ago, read it, because there's a complete Goebbels propaganda. It is not reported in the United States media at all. That is, we have a total revolution taking place 6 weeks ago, and nobody talks about it. So therefore, if it's not intelligence, which is controlled by the financial oligarchy, to put an end to that, countries representing half the world's population decided to form a new development bank. Also, China, at the same time, simultaneously have taken initiative to an Asian development bank, very much based on the same ideas which LaRouche put out in the International Development Bank in 1975. In 1976, a good friend of LaRouche, Indira Gandhi, gave a speech at Colombo, Sri Lanka, where she called for a new just world economic order and new financial structures to support such a new just world economic order, very much based upon LaRouche's ideas put forward a year earlier. Indeed, I was so excited being a young woman at the time that I was leading the Danish organization, So I called a big party in our office because we have won. LaRouche goes out calling for an international development bank, for great infrastructure programs, and then countries, the non-allied countries, a year later, led by Indira Gandhi, goes out and declare that is the policy. But we were not, the forces were not strong enough at that time, and I'm going to try to give an idea now how this has been building through the decades. Can you go forward, please? Yeah. A lot of you know this. This is what LaRouche has called a development corridor. And the reason I think it's important is because when you saw these lines across the globe on the previous slide, it is very important that we think about it how is the most efficiently regarding physical economy. So if you look at the big round things, in the center you have industrial cities surrounded by intense agriculture. The small white circles you see are smaller cities. You have the blue thing going across, it could be a river or a canal. You have another stretch just underneath the blue, which could be gas pipelines, oil pipelines. You have roads connecting in maglev, the whole big trunk of the maglev connecting the city centers. So the idea is to have cities that are 750 to 1 million people each, designed from scratch to be very beautiful and be very efficient for people to function in and to live in, with science centers in the middle, cultural houses, what have you, parks, everything that we can put underground, we put underground. But economically, to think about these development corridors, which is like 150, like 100 miles broad, as a gigantic assembly line. Can you go back to the world language? Where you literally have like a power line of activity of new cities, of power generation, of mining, of processing of the product, and then you can research centers and so forth connecting the entire globe. And that is a Promethean map. This is a map which is anti-oligarchical. This is a future which is anti-oligarchical. Then we have in history for the last several thousand years there has been an ongoing fight of what is man, what is the nature of man. Is man just a slave? Is man a subject? Cheap labor and so forth? Or is there something very special and unique about man? And the empires, most of the man's existence have been controlled by one empire after the other. With the Hobbesian man, how man has, we were running around hunting animals and living in caves, and what advances and leaps mankind has taken for the last several thousand years. Next. So here we have what you can call then a Promethean image of the world language. And if you think about the globe of ours, and think about how huge areas of it is not developed, and now that over half the world population, leaders representing over half the world's population, is now embarking on developing the globe at large, collaborating around a common principle for mutual development, and creating the means for doing so. I want to put out and remember the year 1975 for the older members of the LaRouche organization. That was a very important year. That was the year where Lyndon LaRouche put out the idea of an international development bank. And I think in almost all the nations, it was a green pamphlet. It was green in Denmark and it was green in the United States. I used to go out and sell it at the unemployment centers in Denmark in Danish. We had it in Danish, German, French, Swedish, Italian, Spanish, and so forth. The idea was to create a new bank that would provide long-term cheap credit for in-depth infrastructure developments. That was the idea. Now, jump forward to 6 weeks ago, where the foundation of a new development bank was made by the summit in Brazil with the BRICS meeting, namely an alternative to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the corrupt and bankrupt transatlantic